Welcome back to the Faith and Focus podcast. I'm Laura, and in today's episode we're delving into one of the most theologically rich and philosophically complex topics in the DCT paper. Who was Jesus? Was he truly the Son of God, a revolutionary moral teacher, a political liberator, or all three? In this episode we'll unpack Jesus as the Son of God, Jesus as a teacher of wisdom, and Jesus as a liberator. We'll also explore key texts, theological debates and critical views, all geared towards equipping you for your top grade analysis in your A Level Religious Studies exam. So let's get to it. Right, segment 1, why do you need to know about it? Because you have to know for the spec different views about Jesus' identity and his authority. So that includes different theological claims about his divinity, philosophical interpretations of his moral teaching, and socio-political readings of his ministry. So this topic connects to Christian doctrines of salvation, it connects to ethics, it connects to knowledge of God, and it connects to how Christianity relates to issues like authority and justice. So you need to make sure that you can explain and evaluate contrasting understandings of Jesus, use scriptural references and key scholars, and show some good AO2 skills by weighing up strengths and weaknesses. So let's start with segment 2 and Jesus as the Son of God. First part of this, we're going to look at divine knowledge and relationship with God. So in Mark chapter 6, verses 47 to 52, Jesus walks on water, calms the storm, and evokes God's power over the elements like we see in the Old Testament. Mark chapter 6 verse 50, Jesus says, quote, "It is I, do not be afraid," end quote. This echoes the divine name Ego Eimi, I am, linking Jesus with God's self-revelation to Moses in Exodus. So there's an echo from Exodus in the Old Testament into Mark in the New. This reveals Jesus' divine authority over nature. So that does show that there is some element of God there. It implies the ontological divinity, i.e. being God in essence. So not just a person, but also God in essence on earth. However, weaknesses, it could be interpreted symbolically or mythologically. And skeptics like Bultmann suggest demythologizing text to focus on the existential meaning. So take the myth out of it, and then what does it mean? So what about miracles then? So miracles as signs of divinity. So John chapter 9 verses 1 to 41 talks about the healing of a man born blind. It also emphasises Jesus' role as light of the world. So, quote, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed," end quote. And that's John chapter 9 verse 3. So Jesus, in restoring the man's physical sight, he also restores his spiritual sight. It challenges the Pharisees, who were like the Jewish leaders, and it challenges their understanding of sin and holiness. So it's not the best people, the richest people that are the most holy. When Jesus comes along, he shows that it's actually the poor and the shunned of society that are actually like the most important in God's kingdom. So, strengths of this argument, it reinforces the idea of Jesus as the revealer of divine truth, because obviously you can't do a miracle unless you are God, and it presents a holistic vision of salvation. It's your body and your soul that are important. However, weaknesses, critics like Hume argue that miracles are violations of natural law, and therefore we can't believe in them. They are irrelevant. And do we interpret the miracles, like is it symbolic or is it literal? People would argue both. So another aspect of Jesus that is important is his resurrection. Okay, so quote, "He was declared to be the Son of God by the resurrection from the dead," end quote, and that's Romans chapter 1 verse 4. So for St. Paul, the resurrection is not just a miracle, but it's proof of divinity. Only God could do that, so it can only be God. Like Jesus can only be God. N.T. Wright supports the historicity and theological centrality of the resurrection. So he says, quote, "The resurrection was not just a comfort to the disciples, it was the event that launched Christianity," end quote. Which it is. Okay, it's the start of it all, and it kicks everything into motion. So critics like Bultmann accept the resurrection as meaningful myth, but not a literal event. So it's not something that literally happens, but it's trying to tell us something about Jesus that's important nonetheless. So strengths of this argument, it actually forms the cornerstone of Christian faith. Okay, so the resurrection is the single most important event in Christianity. That's why Easter is more important than Christmas. And it shows Jesus' triumph over death and divine identity. Now, weaknesses, it's really reliant on faith rather than empirical evidence. The belief in the resurrection is exactly that, it's a belief. And although people who are Christian would argue it's written down in the Bible, therefore it's true, is the Bible literally true or symbolically true? So we have this same problem over and time again. And it also talks about contradictory accounts in the Gospels. There are different people that see Jesus in different ways after the resurrection, and that can cause confusion for people, because which account do they believe? Okay, so that wraps up our section about Jesus as the Son of God. So next segment is segment 3, and this is Jesus as teacher of wisdom. So first section of that is repentance and forgiveness. So in Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32, we have the parable of the prodigal son. So the parable of the prodigal son is that, a man has 2 sons. He gives them their inheritance, and one son stays at home and continues to help his dad with the farm and everything, and the other son goes off, blows all his money, and comes back and says, I need some help. I've kind of got myself into a bit of a sticky situation. And the other son gets mad with his dad because he says, well, hang on a minute, I've stayed here and helped you out and done nothing but what I should be doing. He's run off, blown all his money, and now you're welcoming him back as though nothing's happened. And the part of the parable that's important is the fact that it's the mercy of the father to say, yes, you are welcome back with open arms, even though you've made a mistake. Because the prodigal son ultimately says, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. And that's the part that's important. So, quote, "But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion," end quote. So that's from Luke chapter 15, verses 11 to 32 in the parable of the prodigal son. So Hans Young, Jesus redefined religion around interpersonal love and reconciliation, not rules. So whereas Judaism is very much established by the 613 mitzvah and they have to do certain things, Christianity is not like that. It's very much about interpersonal love and the way that we behave with each other rather than what we do to some extent. Right, so strength of this approach, it emphasises God's unconditional love. And it speaks about modern concerns like guilt and restoration and shame and all that kind of stuff. Weaknesses, it might underplay justice or accountability, and it could be seen as too permissive. So it's like, okay then, you can do whatever as long as you say sorry, which is not actually true. Next bit, we'll look at inner purity and moral motivation. So in Matthew chapter 5 verses 17 to 48, Jesus deepens the law, and that's law with a capital L. So the rules of Judaism, Jesus comes along and he says, quote, "You have heard it said, but I tell you," end quote. So he is here to strengthen and deepen the understanding of the law. But it's a different way of interpreting and understanding the law than has gone previously. So he internalises commandments, he shifts the moral focus from external actions to inner motivations. So it's not just about what you do, it's the motivation behind what you do that's important, because God knows. Okay? So Immanuel Kant praised these ethics because it respects autonomy and it respects intention. So that idea of, in Kantian ethics, that you treat somebody like an end, not a means to an end, that's what we mean. So, strengths. It elevates ethics from ritualism to personal integrity. It's up to you. And it's relevant for modern debates. So these are all things that are issues that we face as humans now and Christians now. Weaknesses. can we potentially be held to the same standard as Jesus? Bearing in mind that he is God in human form, right? So that is quite a difficult thing. And also, it can cause guilt. Like, if you are a person who's trying your best and you just can't seem to get it right, then that can cause unnecessary guilt when really it's the intention that you've gone in with that's important. And then segment 4, we're going to look at Jesus as liberator. So we've looked at Jesus as Son of God, Jesus teacher of wisdom, and now we're looking at Jesus as liberator. So he's a liberator of the marginalised. So there are people in Jewish society who are marginalised. They are not to be dealt with. They are what we would call Gentiles. Okay, so anybody who's not Jewish basically is tricky in this time. So in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 24 to 34, Jesus heals a bleeding woman. Now, there are issues around impurity of women when they are bleeding, particularly if it's to do with periods and things like that. So the fact that Jesus heals this woman and says to her, quote, "Daughter, your faith has healed you, go in peace," end quote, that affirms her faith, it affirms her dignity, it treats her like a person who deserves respect, and it ignores those cultural taboos. So he liberates this person from the cultural taboos of being a woman and having a period or having a disease that causes bleeding at the time. So liberation theologians, which we'll come on to later, they argue that Jesus enacted social inclusion and healing. So he actually starts to get society to be inclusive, because it's not just the rich, outwardly good people that have access to God. In Jesus has come to say it's actually everyone else as well. It's not just these particular people. So strengths of this argument: it uplifts the excluded. All right, so it's very helpful for people who are feeling downcast and downtrodden in society to have something to look up to, especially when that someone is Jesus. And it also offers a model for modern inclusion and pastoral care. How are we going to look after society and look after people in society? And it's a good model for that. Weaknesses: it can risk reducing Jesus to a social worker. So he's not just there to help people and support people in their life. He's there as the Son of God. So we need to always remember that. Right, so challenges to religious authority then. So as a liberator, Jesus is challenging the status quo. So in Luke chapter 10, 25 to 37, Jesus gives us the parable of the Good Samaritan. So in the parable of the Good Samaritan, a man's beaten up by a load of robbers, and he's left to die, basically. And there are two people who walk past him, a priest and a Levite, who are senior people in the temple, and they are the ones that walk past him and leave him. And the person who actually comes to his aid is the Samaritan, who is traditionally an enemy. Okay? So it's to say that actually institutionalized religion, i.e. the Levite and the priest, left this person for dead, and it's the other person that helps. Jesus asks, quote, "Which of these was a neighbour?" End quote. And it's obviously the Samaritan. So even though you would expect it to be the Levite or the priest because they're supposed to stick to what they should and shouldn't be doing, it's actually the Samaritan who's traditionally the enemy and the person that they would fight and scorn that actually helps. So that story is showing compassion over ritual. So rather than just doing the things because you've got to do them because that's the religion, it's actually what do you do behind it. So that Samaritan showed compassion regardless, and that's something that we need to follow. So strengths of this argument: it promotes intergroup compassion and ethical action. We're always trying to do what's best. And it exposes hypocrisy. So if you are if you're saying oh yeah, I'm good, I go to church and blah blah blah, but actually you don't, and then this argument is a way of finding out about that. Are you helping your neighbour, or are you walking past them? Weaknesses: it could be used to selectively justify rejection of religious tradition. So you could actually say, well, we don't need religious tradition, we can just do what we want because look what they did. And obviously that's not what Jesus is there to do. Challenges to political authority as a liberator. So Jesus says in Luke chapter 4 verse 18, quote, "He has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to set the oppressed free," end quote. So Jesus' actions, he rides into Jerusalem on a donkey, he cleanses the temple, they all link to messianic and political prophecies that come from the Old Testament. So it's important that he does those things because it kind of like ticks the box for him being the Messiah. And that's obviously what Christians believe Jesus is. So Gustavo Gutiérrez says that Jesus aligned with the oppressed, embodying praxis or faith in action. And we'll come into faith in action when we look at Bonhoeffer as well. So strengths, it provides theological grounding for activism and justice. There is a reason to say this is not good enough as Christians, we're not accepting it. And it also makes Christianity socially relevant. However, weaknesses, critics like Dawkins argue that distorts the spiritual message. It shouldn't be about politics and protest. It should be about love and compassion and following God's teaching. And it also risks politicising the gospel, which is, it's not supposed to be entwined in politics. It's supposed to stand separately, regardless of your politics. Right, segment 5, revision strategy. So Venn diagram comparison, we've done these before. So 3 intersecting circles, 1 for Son of God, 1 for Teacher of Wisdom, and 1 for Liberator. Put examples, scholars and quote into each, and use the overlaps to explore how Jesus' divinity supports his moral teaching, how liberation is rooted in divine authority, and how teaching and activism reflect God's nature. So it's about writing synthesized paragraphs, and that Venn diagram should help you to do that, because you've got the 3 individual things, but then you've also got how they all interlink as well. Okay, and that concludes today's episode on the person of Jesus Christ. So whether you see him as divine, a teacher, or a liberator, it's whether you can explain that and analyse that and evaluate that that's important. So it doesn't really matter what you believe as long as you can explain it. So in the next episode of Faith and Focus podcast, we're going to look at Christian moral principles, looking at the Bible, church tradition, and love as sources of ethical authority. So until then, subscribe, share and revise with purpose, and as always, stay curious, keep questioning and keep learning. Bye!